Hello everyone, this is Jeff with Mississippi and the Civil War. Welcome back for a new episode. And the title of our episode is Murder Will Out, a story of Bleeding Kansas. And you're probably wondering what Bleeding Kansas has to do with Mississippi. Well, it's actually a pretty interesting story. And first I just got to point out, I love this mural I used for the background here. The illustration is called Tragic Prelude, and it's a mural painted by Kansan John Stuart Curry, and it's in the Kansas State Capitol building in Topeka, Kansas. And I think it really illustrates what Kansas went through during, or actually before and during the Civil War, because really the Civil War got started a few years early in Kansas, as this story will illustrate. So I'm just going to get right into it. This story begins in the summer of 1890, long after the Civil War, when Joseph Tribble, a carpenter living in Grenada, Mississippi, decided to make a trip to his boyhood home in Kansas. Now, he had been gone for 30-odd years, and he probably felt that no one back in Kansas would remember him. But he could not have been more wrong. Very shortly after arriving in Kansas, he was recognized and he was immediately arrested. He was charged with the murder of Alexander Kincaid, a crime that had taken place in September 1861 and had its roots in the tragic conflict known as Bleeding Kansas. And just to give you a little background, here we're looking at the territory of Kansas, which is where our story is going to take place, right along the Kansas-Missouri border. And in the 1850s, the turmoil over the Kansas territory really foreshadowed the coming of the Civil War. The conflict had its roots in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was a measure proposed by Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas had wanted to organize the territory because he wanted to build a railroad linking Illinois with California. And Douglas realized that for the act to pass, he would have to make concessions to the South if he was going to obtain their support for the measure. Thus, the act repealed the provision of the Missouri Compromise that prohibited slavery north of 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude in the Louisiana Purchase lands. In addition, both Kansas and Nebraska territories would be thrown open for settlement, and the immigrants themselves would be able to decide whether they wanted to be free or slave states. A concept that would be known as popular sovereignty. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed by Congress in May 1854, and the law immediately set off a firestorm of protest. Abolitionists in the North denounced the act as a slaveholder conspiracy, and that was meant to add additional slave states to the Union. In the South, the law was seen as very popular, as it was seen as it was an opportunity to add slave states to the Union. And they would be able to expand slavery beyond the old 36-degree, 30-minute Missouri Compromise line. Now, an unintended consequence of this law, and one that was going to prove to be very deadly to a lot of people, was that it was going to turn the Kansas territory into a battleground as abolitionist and pro-slavery settlers flooded into the territory, trying to make the new land into either a slave or a free state, depending on their particular outlook. And this was going to lead to a lot of bloodshed. A good example here, and I hope I pronounced this right, Marais des Cygnes massacre in the Kansas Territory, May 19, 1858, is just one example of the kind of bloodshed that took place in Kansas prior to the Civil War. And in his biography of Confederate guerrilla leader William Clark Quantrell, writer Edward E. Leslie kind of summed up very eloquently this not quite a war that was going on in Kansas in the 1850s. And he said in his book, "Just as in Northern Ireland and the Middle East in recent decades, it was a tit-for-tat war, a war of retribution and retaliation. It was characterized by fiery rhetoric, with talented and unscrupulous propagandists on both sides. "War to the knife and knife to the hilt," one newspaper editor cried. It does not matter which side he was on. Such sentiments were echoed by both sides. And that's taken from the book The Devil Knows How to Ride, which is an excellent biography of Quantrill and the border and the larger border wars. Excellent book if you haven't read it. And Joseph Tribble was born into this simmering cauldron of violence. I first found him on the 1850 United States Census as an 11-year-old living in Platte, Andrew County, Missouri, very close to the Kansas border. He was living with his mother and his 7 brothers and sisters. His mother, Cassandra, was a native of Tennessee, and all of the children were born in Missouri. Andrew County, which was located in the northwestern part of Missouri and bordering on Kansas, was home to both pro-Union and pro-slavery citizens during the Civil War, and was on the front lines of the guerrilla war during the conflict. So this was a very interesting place for a young man to grow up. And sometime after 1850, the Tribble family picked up stakes and moved just across the state line to the town of Burr Oak in Donovan County, Kansas, right in the center of the map here. In the 1860 census, Cassandra Tribble reported that she owned an estate worth $200 and had a personal estate valued at $100. 21-year-old Joseph was still living with his mother at this time and listed his occupation as farmhand. And he was probably working on the family farm. And from the size of it, it must have been just a very small hardscrabble farm, because it was not very large given the real estate value of $200 that was listed. And with the outbreak of war in 1861, citizens in Missouri and Kansas began taking sides, and they began donning uniforms to fight. But in Missouri and Kansas, the war would not be confined to soldiers. Civilians would also be caught up in the expanding whirlwind of violence and terror. I don't really know much about Joseph Tribble's life prior to the Civil War, but given the subsequent events, it's safe to say that he was pro-Confederate in sentiment. And living in Kansas, he was bound to rub elbows with pro-Union men, and eventually one of these encounters was going to turn violent. On September 19, 1861, the White Cloud, Kansas chief of White Cloud, Kansas, ran the following story. A Union man named Kincaid was murdered on Sunday week in Burr Oak Township by a Missouri secessionist named Tribble. Kincaid was coming out of church when Tribble stepped up to him and asked him whether he was a coercionist. Kincaid replied in the affirmative when Tribble stabbed him in the heart, then escaped over the river with the assistance of Kansas traders. The murderer is a brother to the ruffian whom the pro-slavery democracy of this county attempted to shove into office of county treasurer 2 years ago. Now, the murdered man was Alexander Kincaid, a small farmer who lived in Donovan County. In the 1860 United States Census for Donovan County, Kincaid listed his birthplace as New York, and he stated that he had a personal estate worth $120. Again, just another very small farmer, very much like Tribble. And one interesting fact about Kincaid's listing in the 1860 census, he is on the same page with Joseph Tribble and his family, meaning that they were neighbors. They lived very close by. In fact, you can see in the 1860 page that I've put here, and I had to condense this a little bit because they were on opposite ends of the page, but you see at the top here, Cassandra Tribble, the head of her household, and down below is Alexander Kincaid, head of his household. And being that these two were neighbors, they probably came into contact with each other fairly often, and their opposing political views were eventually going to lead to tragedy. And this is another article about the murder from the Elmwood Free Press, September 14, 1861. And again it says, a Union man stabbed. On Sunday last at Columbus, Mr. Alexander Kincaid, an estimable young man who has taken an active part in the cause of the Union, was brutally assassinated by a secessionist from Missouri. You can really tell the political leanings of the newspaper editor here, who was lurking around the neighborhood evidently for that purpose. A meeting has been held, and as soon as the service was over, the villain called Mr. Kincaid to one side, stabbed him, and then fled to the river and escaped to Missouri. Now, after killing Kincaid, Joseph Tribble did not wait around to face Kansas justice. Now, where exactly he went, I have not been able to discover, but he next appears as a private serving in Company A of the 1st Missouri Cavalry, CSA. He enlisted in December 1861, and his service he was going to see a good bit of action during his wartime service. He served in the Missouri State Guard, fought at Blue Mills, Lexington, Sugar Creek, Bentonville, Elkhorn Tavern, Farmington, Iuka, and Corinth. He briefly deserted on May 1st, 1863, or more likely just took AWOL to go home for a while, but returned in February of 1864 and then fought at New Hope Church, Lattimore House, Kennesaw Mountain, the Atlanta campaigns, Lovejoy, Altoona, Franklin, and then he deserted again at Nashville December 6, 1864. Now, Joseph Tribble had enlisted in the 1st Missouri Cavalry along with his brother Andrew. The older sibling had been promoted to sergeant, but he was captured at the Battle of Pea Ridge, Arkansas, March 7th and 8th, 1862, and got sent to a prisoner of war camp at Alton, Illinois. And apparently this was enough of war for Andrew. He took the oath of allegiance to the United States and was released from prison. And as far as I can tell, he never served in the Confederate Army again. Now, after Joseph Tribble deserted from the Confederate Army in December 1864, he drops out of sight until 1880, when he shows up on the United States Census in Grenada, Mississippi. At that time, the 41-year-old lists his occupation as carpenter, and he was living with his wife, Libiza, and their children, Claudia, Andrew, and Cassandra. Joseph had spent a considerable amount of time during the war in Mississippi, and perhaps he liked what he saw of the state, or perhaps he met his wife while he was serving there and ended up wanting to come back to Mississippi. But he had to know that with the war over, returning to Kansas or Missouri could have been very dangerous for him, seeing as he was wanted for murder. But I think by 1890, with 30 years between him and the crime, Tribble must have felt relatively safe going back to his old haunts in Kansas. But really, he could not have been more wrong. And shown here is a picture of the depot at Wathena, Kansas, which is where Tribble was arrested for the crime of murder after he stepped off the train. And there's a good newspaper article about this. There's a good newspaper article about the arrest of Tribble and what happened immediately thereafter. And the newspaper article is headlined, "Murder Will Out. Arrested for killing a man in Kansas nearly 30 years ago. St. Joseph, Missouri, July 5th, 1890. Joseph Tribble, whose residence is a plantation in the state of Mississippi." I don't think where he lived could be called a plantation. It was a small farm. You couldn't call it a plantation by any stretch of the imagination. But anyway, it went on to say, he was arrested at an early hour this morning in Wathena, a little town just across the river from St. Joseph in the state of Kansas. Tribble was a resident of Wathena 29 years ago, at a time when border ruffians and bushwhackers run almost everything on the Kansas and Missouri sides of the river. It was during these times in the year 1861 that Tribble, who sympathized with the Confederate cause, murdered Thomas Kincaid, who was a Northern sympathizer and who was at the time preparing to enlist in the Union Army. Immediately after the murder, on account of the feud existing between Missourians and Kansans, Tribble made his escape, going to Mississippi, where he entered the Confederate Army and served as a private until Lee's surrender. Well, that part is not quite right. He deserted in 1864, but otherwise, I think the article is fairly accurate. But it went on to say, after the war, he settled on a Mississippi plantation, quote-unquote plantation, actually small farm, was married and now has in Mississippi a wife and 3 children who have not yet been notified of the trouble he has gotten into. He had never visited his old home until the first day of the present month, when he came to St. Joe and went to see friends in a little town 10 miles north of here, and on the 4th he went to attend a celebration. He had no idea that any of his old acquaintances would recognize him, but they did, and his arrest followed. The murder was committed with a butcher knife in the month of September 1861, and curious to say, the identical knife was found on his person when arrested. Tribble acknowledged that the knife was the one he used to murder Kincaid, and when asked why he carried it, yet he answered, "I was coming back here on a visit for the first time since the crime was committed, and thought I would bring my friend of those times back with me." Tribble is now in jail at Troy, Kansas. And again, that just blows my mind that he would bring back with him the knife he had used to murder a man. That's a weird souvenir to bring back when you're making a trip home. That's just odd, but it is what it is. And shown here in the illustration, this is the courthouse at Donovan County in Troy, Kansas, and this is where Tribble was going to be tried for his life. And the Omaha Daily Bee in Omaha, Nebraska, published an account of the trial on July 16, 1890, and their story includes more details about the murder. Their story states, "Great was the excitement at Troy, Donovan County, this state. Today the occasion being the preliminary examination of Joseph Tribble, who was arrested July 4th at Wathena for the murder of Alexander Kincaid on September 8th, 1861. Tribble was a rebel, Kincaid a man of Union tendencies, although neither belonged to the regular armies. On the day mentioned, which was Sunday, the boys, both under 21, met at a camp meeting. A quarrel ensued, and they went at each other. Kincaid with a butcher knife, Tribble with a bowie knife. Kincaid was killed. Tribble went to Mississippi and did not reappear until July 4th, when he was arrested. Today he was bound over in the sum of $7,000, which he is unable to give. The most intense excitement prevailed at Troy during the trial. The courtroom was crowded by men who had rebel tendencies and men of Union proclivities who openly stated them now. Tribble has a wife and 5 children in Mississippi in destitute circumstances. He made no defense at the preliminary examination today." And what interesting statement put forth in this article. It noted that both Kincaid and Tribble had knives, that it wasn't just Tribble stabbing Kincaid to death. If this is true, that puts kind of a new complexion on the death, because you couldn't, if they both had knives, Tribble might be able to make a claim of self-defense, and you would, as it turns out, that's exactly what he was going to do. By early August, word of Joseph Tribble's predicament had made its way back to Mississippi. On August 2nd, 1890, the Grenada Sentinel of Grenada, Mississippi, ran the following article, and it stated, "Mr. Joe Tribble in trouble, arrested in Kansas for killing a man in 1861. Several weeks ago, Mr. Joe Tribble of Jefferson left here to visit relatives at Troy and at other places in Kansas. While there, he was arrested, charged with killing of one man, Mr. Alexander Kincaid, in 1861. It seems that Mr. Kincaid was a rabid Federalist man, while Mr. Tribble was equally as strong a Confederate. They got into a dispute in which Mr. Kincaid was killed, and Tribble left the country and joined the Confederate Army. Mr. Tribble has had a preliminary trial in Kansas some time since and was bound over in the sum of $5,000, which bond he has not been able to give. None but state witnesses were examined, and Mr. Tribble and his lawyers, as well as friends, claim that they can easily prove that the killing was done purely in self-defense when the trial comes before the circuit court. Some of his Army comrades and other friends have been appealed to and are now raising money to help him out of his trouble. We trust that all who can will contribute toward that end, and that Mr. Tribble will be acquitted. He made a brave Confederate soldier and has a number of friends in this section. It will be hard for him to get full justice among the strangers who know and care nothing for the South, but to hate and malign her and her people. Yeah, this case really caused a sensation. The newspapers were full of very incendiary columns, like this one from the St. Joseph Herald, July 9th, 1890. It was cold-blooded, the murder of Alexander Kincaid by Joseph Tribble. So you can see it where I'm sure Tribble wondered if he was going to be able to get impartial justice in Kansas, but only time would tell. And the Grenada Sentinel article was very sympathetic to Tribble, but he was going to be tried by a Kansas jury, so his defense attorney was certainly going to have his work cut out for him. And the Kansas City Times devoted considerable length to the trial on October 10th, 1890, and they said in a big headline, Joseph Tribble's hearing for murder in 1861 opened at Troy. The case of Joseph Tribble for the murder of Alexander Kincaid in September 1861 was called in the district court yesterday morning, and the day was consumed in endeavoring to secure a jury. A special voir dire of 26 names was issued, and this morning a jury was obtained and the trial begun. At 3 o'clock this afternoon, the state rested its case. Boy, trials went a lot faster back in the 19th century than they do today, and a short adjournment was had to enable the defense to prepare its side. One witness for the state testified that he stood by and saw Tribble stab Kincaid without any hostile demonstration on the part of the latter, and that he repeated the blow in the back after Kincaid started to run. Also that before the first blow, Kincaid had declined to fight Tribble. A lady testified that on the day of the murder, she was visiting at a neighbor's when Tribble came with bloody hands, and upon being offered a basin of water to wash them, replied that he wanted the blood to remain so that when he reached Price's army, he could show them the blood of an abolitionist. Now I can imagine after hearing this kind of testimony, the jurors were going to have a difficult time determining the truth from witnesses that told opposite stories, because one of the defense witnesses stated that it was that Kincaid had threatened Tribble, and that Tribble had only stabbed him in self-defense. So you've got opposing stories that the jury is going to have to try and sort out, and they had a man's life hanging in the balance. So I'm sure it made for some very difficult deliberations by the jury. And these days a murder case in a major trial would probably take months, months upon months. But back in the 19th century, these things went a lot faster. And in the October 16th, 1890 edition of the St. Joseph Weekly Gazette, the verdict of the trial was announced in all caps: Tribble not guilty. And the article went on to say, Joseph Tribble was acquitted of a murder in Donovan County, Kansas today, committed over 30 years ago. Tribble was a Southern sympathizer, and the man he killed was Alexander Kincaid, a recruiting officer for the Union Army. The evidence conclusively showed that Tribble acted wholly in self-defense. Tribble is a resident of Mississippi and was arrested here the 4th day of July last while on a visit to his relatives in this section. And without having access to the trial transcripts, it's really hard to second guess the verdict of the jury. 30 years between the killing and the trial must have worked in Tribble's favor. Memories fade over time. Some witnesses died or moved away, I'm sure. And then the animosities also generated by the war had decades to subside. And I'm sure all of these factors probably had something to do with the fact of the not guilty verdict. With his name cleared, Tribble was able to return home to Mississippi and to the loving embrace of his wife and children, who were overjoyed to see him. He had endured a difficult few months, but I have to think that the acquittal must have given him peace of mind, because now he would no longer have the threat of a jury verdict hanging over him and a possible death sentence at that. In fact, in one newspaper, it said he had been 29 years in dread of the hangman's noose, which is probably right. And so Tribble would no longer have to worry about a death at the gallows. But, I do wonder if his conscience ever bothered him. And I wonder if he ever had nightmares and had to relive the killing in his dreams. You just don't know. You'd like to hope that he had some kind of guilt about it, but you just don't know. Unfortunately, the historical record is entirely silent. Now, the last mention I can find of Joseph Tribble is actually in his wife's Confederate widow's pension application from the state of Mississippi. In 1916, the 71-year-old woman applied for a pension in Hinds County, Mississippi. She declared she owned no property and lived with her son. She also wrote that she and Joseph were married on March 3rd, 1867, so they did marry after the war, and that he had died on July 10th, 1898. And that's it. It's just a sad, brutal story of bleeding Kansas. And stories like this, unfortunately, were all too common in Kansas and Missouri at that time. It was a bloody civil war within a civil war. And it caught up a lot of innocent people, and a lot of innocent lives were lost because of it. And before I go, I just wanted to mention, I think I brought up in my last episode that I was going to be doing something special to commemorate having passed 300 subscribers. And I will be doing a giveaway. I have a new article that just came out in the current issue of the Artilleryman magazine. And the article is called Old Saratoga, a Revolutionary War Cannon in Natchez, Mississippi. And this is a great little story. This cannon was given to the city of Natchez by Andrew Jackson in 1815, and it became a treasured relic of the city of Natchez up through the Civil War. And it's an interesting little story. And I'm going to give away a couple of autographed copies of this magazine because they sent me several of them as a thank you for writing the article. So very shortly, stay tuned for a short episode where I'm going to make an announcement where you can register to try and win one of these autographed magazines that I'm sure one day will be worth tens of dollars. So look for this very soon. Anyone that's subscribed to the channel will be able to sign up for the giveaway. You just have to make a comment, but within the next day or so, I'm going to just release a very short video. All you have to do is be a registered member of the channel and just make a comment to the video. So just be on the lookout for that in the next couple of days. And thank you again for watching. If you liked it, please give it a like. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel and you'd like to see more content, please subscribe, because that really gives me a boost to my ego and makes me want to do more episodes. But thank you very much for viewing.